Hello, hello.
Recording in progress.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and Assalamu alaikum. My name is Sarah Khan. I am the Manager Communications and Outreach here at Beacon House National University, and I welcome you all to the grand finale of Design Summit Lahore 01 at our beautiful campus today, hosted by BNU MD SWAD in collaboration with Rhode Island School of Design and PWCA. Unlike any other event in Lahore, Design Summit serves as a platform for international speakers to come together and have discussions around design, not just in the context of Pakistan, but the broader global South. So before further ado, I will be introducing the first panel for today. Introducing our first panel, Planetary Geographies, led by Professor Ijlal Muzaffar, with Pietros Babasikas, Aurelien Leminaire, and chaired by Dr. Razia Sadiq. We're going to continue with this panel. Some of the speakers already spoke yesterday, so today just a few panelists are left. May I please invite on stage Mr. Petros Babasikas to continue with his presentation. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. Okay, I think I'm fully connected. Picking up on the planetary geographies discussion from yesterday, I also wanted to thank the Design Summit, BNU, RISD for their hospitality and for their support. It's a real honor to be here, and last night was amazing, completely unexpected to see all your incredible work around the city. So congratulations on that. It's a really big achievement. Um, my name is Petros Babasikas. I am an architect. I'm also a professor and I direct a program at the University of Toronto, the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design, which is this place. I'm flying there in 2 days. It's an island in the middle of Toronto. It is a public university, and the program I'm running is a liberal arts program. I had some very interesting discussions also with members of your school here, BNU, about our educational philosophy, about multidisciplinarity, diversity, global outlook. Our program is very much geared toward that. I feel it's not a bad idea to tell you where I'm coming from. Toronto is one of the most diverse cities in the world. 50% of our students and 50% of people living in Toronto are from other parts of the world. So this is very much part of our student body as well. And we're very invested in research through making. We're also very invested in learning how to learn. The program is a program that somehow empowers students to be change makers, to pursue their own lines of research. My program is an architecture program, but not everyone goes into architecture after graduating our program. Many go into different fields of design. Everything okay with the lights? Just on, off, whatever works. So I also teach design at Toronto, at the University of Toronto. I run a master's studio. Our master's program is a pre-professional architecture program. Again, with students from all over the world, 2 to 3 years of study. My studio is a studio that focuses on crisis and activism and engagement, and it engages students to work together with agents, organizations from around the world, to try and have an impact. So that's just part of some of the interests and of the introduction. So that perhaps some of the work they do can begin from a very humble point of view to affect change in different crises around the world. So projects include working with urban voids, incomplete projects, trying to create different community works and ways to impact, responding to projected climate crisis, extraction. I ask my students quite often for the first term of this year-long thesis studio to make films. We use short film as a kind of, as a way to figure out exactly what our design will be about, and also as a way to communicate it and to share it with others so that they might not reinvent the wheel when they research a similar place or problem 3 or 5 or 10 years down the line. So these visual essays, as we call them, are very important parts of the work, as are also exhibitions. At the end of these design projects, students make things and they exhibit them within the faculty. So I just wanted to just show you a few things about who I am and where I come from and what my philosophy is. Often students work together and they make models which are also ongoing research questions and depositories of knowledge and of their own work, let's say archives. My own personal work and research really focuses on the Mediterranean city. And so I'm getting closer to the kind of planetary geographies that I will be talking to you about today. I've spent 12 years of my life in the city of Athens in Greece before going to Toronto. And again, there I've been designing public spaces. I've been making installation projects and exhibitions. And I've also been studying the city with students and on my own, very interested in exactly the same public spaces that we saw yesterday activated in the city of Lahore. Both monuments, but also markets, and all these other kind of liminal public spaces that are very unique and very active in my part of the world. But also urban voids, also these parts of the city that are somehow invisible or under kind of uncertain ownership, and the scarcity of water and water crisis, and water as a public space, especially in the Mediterranean city, because we have less and less and less of it. This is a project with the Athens municipality where we're trying to reinstate 88 medieval fountains as kind of new designs to have access, public access to water around the city of Athens. But that's not what my lecture is about. Some of the ideas there perhaps will connect. I wanted to talk to you about one part of the world where I've been working on for the past 5 years through a series of different artifacts, a series of different objects, designed objects that we made, I made, others made, or I encountered that completely changed my way of working and thinking, and also a series of geographical, let's say, element or geo-ecological forms that I encountered. So I will be talking to you about one very specific area of the Mediterranean Sea, of the East Aegean Sea. It is an area that is kind of pictured here from the plane, a group of islands between the Greek islands and the coast of Turkey. That also connects directly to an idea that I've been kind of working on, and a term that has been important in the history of architecture of the 20th century, but maybe in the history of map making in the world ever since, the archipelago. This is the Aegean Sea, drawn by a cartographer in the 17th century. And this is the archipelago. The first archipelago was a kind of oral word in Greek, meaning chief sea, from two Greek words. And the Greeks were referring to this as this group of islands that are currently between the current nation states of Greece and Turkey. The Cycladic Islands, the Dodecanese Islands, as we call them, the Sporades, a network of places that have been in constant communication for thousands of years. The archipelago is a term that first appears in writing, at least within the kind of discourse of the Western world, in the 16th century, reinvented by the Venetians, a colonial power who is trying to make a deal in this area. Can you see my mouse, maybe? Yes. Of the Aegean Sea, which is the area that I'm studying and I've been working on and I'm going to talk to you about. It's called the Icarian Sea to the north of Samos and Icaria, and to the south it's called the East Aegean Sea. The Venetians were kind of negotiating with the Ottomans on trading rights and on access to the islands. So they invented this term as a legal kind of term to describe this territory. And some of these maps are descriptions also of this territory. They begin to kind of tell a story about a border which makes little sense, a border that has always been crossed by cultures and knowledge, but also by catastrophic events. We think of the archipelago as a space that is mostly islands in a figure ground of blue, or this kind of secondary neutral ground. But actually the archipelago is most importantly a network, and the field itself is often as important as the islands. This is a site in the island of Samos. It's been there for maybe 2,500 years. It's an archaeological site, a temple to Hera, goddess Hera. It's also showing across the water the coast of Asia Minor, the coast of Asia. And this crossing is a very important crossing. It's a crossing that has transformed the world. This is the same column a couple of years ago. It's still there. It's part now of an archaeological site. And this is the same sea, the same crossing, now from the Greek island of Samos looking across to Turkey, the coast of Turkey. Um, I found myself in this place with a group of artists called the Depression Era Project, documenting about 5 years ago a very particular moment in time, which was the migrant and refugee crisis of people moving, over 1 million people in 2015, across the Aegean Sea, trying to gain entrance to the European Union. And this is a crossing that has happened again for thousands of years, but it's also a crossing that has been traumatic and catastrophic and has claimed many, many lives. We were working and kind of trying to realize what was happening at the time, and we were very perplexed because we were seeing this massive force of global tourism completely transforming the islands. They're always thought of this as this tourist paradise. And at the same time, refugees arriving on the coastline from another part of the world that is only 2 kilometers away. And this crossing is a very significant condition. So we proposed this project called The Tourists as part of a art exhibition, and I designed kind of this ruined pavilion where images from many photographers who were working on the front line of the crisis were also represented, and other artists, lens-based artists. And we're trying to define this sort of subject of the tourist as this person who is always a bit out of time, always a bit confused, and kind of witnessing these parallel global events converging at the same place at the same time, tourism and war. Refugees from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Africa, arriving at the Greek shores, and this crossing has continued. This project traveled around the world, around Western Europe, mostly as a reminder to Western Europeans of some of the injustices that were taking place there. But this pavilion was kind of is the first artifact I wanted to talk about, also as a documentation of the crossing and of this moment in time and place, and this duality that is occurring, that has been occurring at the sea. A very different crossing happened there 130 years ago. This is what the Strait of Mycale, as we call it on the Greek side, is called. And this is how close it is, looking from the Greek island of Samos to the Turkish coast. The Turkish coast is this beautiful landscape that is a conservation area. And it's not too inhabited. North of that area is the city of Izmir, or Smyrna, as we call it in Greek. And the city of Izmir is a major cosmopolitan city, and many of the crossings happen on the north side of there. 130 years ago, the last large cat of Europe crossed this border, this political border, not really understanding that this was a border, propelled by a wildfire on the Asian side, and proceeded to inhabit the Greek island of Samos for about 2 years. The islanders didn't know what to do about it, and this is the late 19th century. There's a great story about them kind of trying to deal with the leopard eating its livestock, and then 2 brothers somehow trapped it into a cave. One brother wore a tree trunk to protect himself from the leopard, descended in the cave after 3 months of having it enclosed there, fought with the leopard, died, and then the second brother finally extinguished the last leopard of Europe that crossed over from Asia in this very fluid border. And this is probably the last thing that the dead brother saw before he died. But it's a very strange gaze, in my opinion. It kind of talks about our inability maybe to understand nature, and how we've been dealing with nature and with these natural processes at this crossing. The crossing is, in fact, a continental shelf, and it's an extremely biodiverse area. This is, let's say, the most reasonable map that I can show you of the place, a Google view. And this entire area is a very shallow area of sea, about 80 meters deep, and it borders with a very deep area of sea, about 1.5 kilometers deep. It's called the Icarian Trench and the continental shelf. When the two come together, they create a very interesting ecological condition. Right here, between Icaria and Samos, at the island of Furni, is one of the most richest and biodiverse marine environments in the whole of the Mediterranean. Because you have large mammals, you have whales, you have dolphins, meeting all the animals that live within this habitat. And you have some of the rarest corals in the Mediterranean Sea, the few ones that are left. So it's another kind of crossing, and it's another way to imagine this border. I was very lucky in that exhibition in 2019 to meet and to start working and collaborating with an institution that is called the Archipelagos Institute for Marine Conservation. This is an amazing NGO that has a fleet of ships and a number of researchers and students and permanent staff. Their mission is really to patrol and monitor the East Aegean Sea, and they're fighting a losing battle against overfishing and over-tourism and really the degradation of this natural environment. And as an architect, we had many things to do together with them, but mostly we had many things to learn. And this is the fifth artifact I wanted to show you. This is a cage. It sits at a bay at the edge of an island in this sea, next to a post-industrial and industrial building that was never used in the island of Lipsi in the East Aegean Sea. This is a very strange object, and I didn't quite know what to make of it when I first met it. But in fact, when this cage is placed down into the water, it becomes a housing project. It becomes a housing project for fish and marine animals. To me, that was a kind of moment of revelation. I was working with our friends. These are fish eggs, and this is a close-up of the underwater garden that actually this cage creates. I was working with our friends, trying to kind of come up with solutions for a project that we call now the Aegean Marine Life Sanctuary. In this very deep bay, fjord-like, very secure, where their plan is to create a sanctuary for wild and injured animals, dolphins, monk seals, and turtles. And we were trying to collaborate and find different ways to rejuvenate the landscape and the seascape. And we were inventing these artificial reefs. My artificial reef, the one I was designing in the university with my laboratories, was a prototype. It was this sort of permeable concrete blocks that we were going to descend into the water. They cost about $100,000 to develop and prototype and test. The cage cost €5. And it was a kind of limit of knowledge moment for me, because then I saw this, and I saw how easily it worked. And I realized I had to change completely my attitude toward observing and making things with the Archipelagos Institute of Marine Conservation, because they're an amazing organization that is very reactive, that tries to find solutions with very limited resources and have small-scale objects that have high impact. So this is how we started working on developing this ex-fish packing factory at the edge of the bay into an animal hospital, into an education center and an advocating for the conservation of this landscape, and also into a sustainable project, mostly designed for animals, not for humans. But at the same time, we're coming up with ways to rejuvenate the landscape and to rejuvenate the seascape, because one of the amazing work that the Archipelagos Institute of Marine Conservation do is that they reforest the seafloor. So they are no longer a client to a designer. They're no longer a program to be solved. They're a partner, and we become mediators, trying to find a way to help them and for them to help us change this place, make it into a pilot project that maybe can bring other projects in place. I know I'm running a bit out of time, so I'm just going to show you very quickly some of the ideas. The project is in development. We're waiting to get an environmental permit that would allow them to enclose and fully protect the bay. Animals arrive there from many different sources, including the sea itself, but also captured animals. One of the most amazing things I learned about dolphins in that place is that dolphins never sleep. They don't have eyelids, and they always sleep, let's say, with one eye open. So when you keep an animal in captivity, the only way it deals with that condition is by sleeping 23 hours a day. And dolphins go crazy when they're in a small tank because their territory is not a tank. Their territory is this entire sea. Their way of understanding and geolocating and behaving is that sea. When you keep them in a small tank, they lose it. It's the worst torture you can inflict to the animal, in fact. So we started designing this place for dolphins, and we started rehabilitating a landscape that is really organized to retain water in a traditional stone-based way. We started adaptively reusing the building, and it's in phase 0 right now. We're going to move to these drawings hopefully a year from now. And then Archipelago also started adaptively rejuvenating the seafloor. Hopefully this is what the project would look like 2 years from now, crossing fingers and waiting for the environmental permit to come out. We started having to come up with designs, drawing techniques, I don't know how good this shows, for the 5 different habitats that exist underwater. And we started getting data from the marine biologists and from their systems of imaging the seafloor and translating it into vector drawings so that they can also keep a record of some of the changes they're doing. And this is them replanting Posidonia oceanica forest. Blue carbon is one of the most effective ways to capture carbon on the planet, 5 times more effective than trees above water, and also takes 10 years longer to actually grow. So when discussing with local marine biologists and with local fishermen about what this place was like, you discover a completely different story in words of a sea that has valleys and forests and trenches and all these different plants that you have no idea of what they are. It is remarkable. A lot of these stories are no longer of the present because this sea is slowly getting lost. The corals and the extremely biodiverse floor of the East Aegean Sea is getting scraped by trolling fishing and by over-tourism. So it's receding actually from, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, 10 meters underwater. It's receding to 80 and 90 and 100 meters underwater, and the Archipelago Institute is monitoring that. And this is another character who told us a story, a local fisherman that used a very specific way of harvesting sponges. This is a local craft in the East Aegean Sea, the island of Kalymnos. These people were legendary because they could hold their breath for many minutes. This is again a craft that is no longer possible and available because their range of breath in order to find these dead sponges, which then they're harvested, can no longer hold. And also parasites have invaded this sea, bleaching out some of these conditions. The last artifact I wanted to talk to you about is also a parallel study we started doing as part of this work with the Marine Life Sanctuary, looking at vernacular architecture, but really at ways to separate the landscape and to organize it, to allow it to retain its water and restore its watershed, using cisterns and using different ways of holding the earth from eroding. And this was part of the landscape rejuvenation project and some of the bioretention that we did around the Marine Life Sanctuary building. But it developed into another project. I think my black and white buildings, well, are barely showing. Around the sea, around the archipelago, there are about 121 uninhabited islets, uninhabited by humans. These islets are inhabited by other creatures. They're inhabited by migratory birds that fly from Madagascar to the steppes of Russia. and they make a stop there to give birth to their young. Each one of the islets is a completely different ecosystem. You have islets that are about 100 meters apart, and they have a completely different vegetation and a completely different system. And of course, the sea underneath is their connecting tissue. These places are experiencing an extreme crisis. And the crisis is, I think, what you may begin to see in this photo. The crisis is goats. The European Union funds, as one of Greece's main sort of productive activities, the raising of goats. But the way that they fund the raising of goats is that they pay each farmer 20 euro per head, per goat they reproduce, and that's it. So farmers get the money, they have goats make more baby goats, and then they take the goats and they dump them on these islands and they let them there to die. What these goats do, and this is a European Union policy that kind of by reverse engineering creates desertification across a sea that is a very ancient sea. We have records and we have knowledge even from 50 years ago and from the local kind of herdsmen and fishermen and inhabitants that have been harvesting these islands very carefully for thousands of years, that these islands can be gardens, that these islands can be extremely productive agricultural and cultural spaces. Some of them are also archaeological spaces. And we are now facing the plague of goats. So with the Archipelago Institute, our next project is to actually, we're trying to negotiate for them to, for the local municipality to give us one or two of these 120, I think I have them somewhere, uninhabited islets. And test in this island some of the rejuvenation, landscape rejuvenation, wall reconstruction and small building reconstruction techniques that we have already been working on in the sanctuary with the aim of turning these islands back into a garden. So this is another project that is at the works. We located, this is my students from the University of Toronto visiting and doing a kind of first survey of the place. We've now worked with them for almost 3 years. We've located this particular island. It's called Anthropophagos, which is a very strange name. It means man-eater, at the south of another island complex. And we will be trying to set up a perimeter and slowly establish a research base while rejuvenating the entire island, hopefully starting this July. So we will see what happens. I hope some of these ideas speak about this field, this part of the world, where the actual political border is not really recognized by animals and by the natural processes and by the many catastrophes that cross it. Large-scale, human-engineered catastrophes, war, but also natural catastrophes, and also the climate crisis. Everything is connected and everything has been happening there for a long time. This was a crossing actually that my grandmother crossed as a refugee from Asia Minor to Greece, well, now almost 100 years ago. And people have been crossing this border for longer than we can remember. We tried, I don't know if you can see this on the screen, this is a map that is about 3 meters by 3 meters large when it is printed. It's trying to document some of these stories, including the story of the leopard and the story of the marine sanctuary, and some historic events. So we tried to make this document that is almost a record of everything we've been doing there, in recognizing that this is a very special part of the world, and that it's also a place of the world where you can also challenge our ways of working and thinking as designers toward facing, this uncertain future that we're in. That's the story. Thank you. Sorry if I went a bit over long. This is for you. I'm going to sit down because the chairs are.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you. If you haven't gotten tired hearing me, I promise I'll try to keep it short. Time is short. Let me look at this. So I thought I'll present my talk in planetary geographies. It kind of deals with some of these connections that we have been trying to map. What's a planet? If planet is the infinite idea of the world, then how does design and technology relate to it, right? So I've argued in the introduction that our idea of the world, the way we imagine it, is a finite thing, and the way we imagine technology is something that connects, one part to another. So we are very, imagine connections to be certain and finite, and claim to know how it works. So I was trying to rethink that relationship between technology and planetarity, and one of the projects that came along was by my dear colleague Paula Gaetano-Adi, who's a colleague at RISD, an artist, Argentinian American artist, who makes these robots from open technology in different parts of the world, and she calls them indigenous robots, and then they take different paths. But when I crossed I went one of these journeys in December, January, yeah. Started planning in December, and by the time I got there, January. So January, and Alejandro was with me. And after being on the expedition, I renamed, if it changes, it's kind of stuck, hold on. Yeah, I'm trying to go out of the presentation. It's getting stuck. No? Really? All right, let's see. Okay. Okay. All right, try two. My laptop is hanging somehow. All right, so I changed the name of my talk. Now it's called Planetary Technology and My Horses Behind. Let me explain. The expedition was this robot that Paolo Gaetano-Adi made. It looks like a guanaco, which is kind of like a llama, but it's a native animal to the Andes. And she made this thing with open parts, so using technologies from various companies. Hyundai was a sponsor, but the idea was that no prototypes were going to be used. This was meant to cross the historic journey of Jose Saint Martin, who was a liberatory general which assembled a revolutionary army and crossed this part of the Andes in Argentina, from Argentina first into Chile, and then into Peru, liberating Chile, Peru, and then came back into Argentina and liberated Argentina. The politics of that journey and its liberation, there are many sides of it. It itself is complicated, but it's highly revered as that an undertaking taken by the people. The army was assembled by the people, with small funds. So it's almost a mythical journey. It's also a legendary journey, and this is the historic path you can see in the map to your right. How Jose San Martin's army crossed. This is the path that we took crossing. The robot was supposed to cross this path, and we were going to follow it on a horseback expedition with a film crew, following the journey. So we started in the lake, which looks like salt plains, but it's clay. a long abandoned or long dried lake, at the base of the mountain. And I started taking photos. There was this film crew, and the robot looked just, amazing against that background. It's just breathtaking. The scale defies you, and you're like, it feels like another planet. But it didn't always work. So there were moments when, everyone rushed and the robot had collapsed. So, they would fix it, put it next to a mule, and then it had to be tested to be put on the mule because it can't really walk through all those treacherous paths. Sometimes the mule liked it, sometimes it didn't like it. This new thing on its back. But then they kind of became friends, I think. So then we went up the mountains, with this thing, and that's Alejandro. He really did not want to be photographed in that hat, but I was making sure I got every shot. And then it went down the mountains. And then, in planes, it walked over these rocks, waving its tail and this. What was the flag for? The flag is kind of.
It's sort of a reference to the Ejército Revolucionario para la Revolución Zapatista, Mexican Marcos Army, the Zapatistas.
Okay.
Some of the reference to that.
But it was made for the journey by the local artisans. Yes, to mark this kind of the memory of the Revolutionary Army, and also the local sort of indigenous interpretations of it. So then, sorry, I'm going back. And at other times, it stopped working again. So we sat down, so there was a lot of investment, a lot of fixing it. This is the slide of we finally get to the crossing into Chile, and it kind of didn't want to cooperate. So it was lifted by hand, pulled up. You can hear the wind. It's a very windy place. And then you can see how much control, sort of care it needed, photographers, filmmakers. And we turn it on. And it starts walking, but backwards, and collapsed. So this became a puzzle for me initially, right? So this is this robot. This was supposed to lead the army, and it's sometimes work according to my naive interpretation, and sometimes it doesn't work. So why didn't we just use a drone like this and just flew it through the cool, nice, through the valleys and made a really cool drone and job done, right? Or a remote control car. So why carry this big robot on this thing which is working half the time? Because every time it hit a rock on which they had tested this in the laboratory, but the rock, the pressure, the combination, too much current demanded by one motor as opposed to the other motor, and something would go wrong, and so it would just shut down. This kind of present this way of thinking, my thinking, right, that this is working and not working, I would say drew from a certain Western paradigm, and this is the title of the book by Alexander Pope, who wrote in as a poem, a satiristic poem against the British monarchy. It's called the Dunciad, that this kingdom, in which there's so much knowledge, there's so much technology, but, the leaders or even the public is, dumb as a donkey, right? So all of the world knowledge is piled up on top of the donkey, and even the owl of Minerva is sitting on top of it, right? But the donkey is just sitting there and he's just munching grass, right? So he has nothing to do with what's on top of him. He can't value it, right? So on one hand, there's this technology which has been made with, so much effort, so much care for years, and it's sitting on top of a mule, right? And the mule couldn't care less, right? So this division but this is our conventional idea of technology, right? And this was precisely what, Paolo Gaetano was trying to challenge, right? There is another idea. It made me think, and I started sort of looking, okay, what was the deal? Because the harness for the robot was designed from the beginning, that it was anticipated that it would go up on the mule. It was anticipated that it will stop working, right? And why didn't you use a prototype that could be tested? And why test it in the field, right? So this is a different idea of technology. This draws or moves, right, from the technology that we get angry that this is not working, right? Those are the terminologies we use. Georges Congelheim was a French philosopher, teacher of Foucault. He wrote this article a long time ago. This is a reprint, Machine and Organism, in which he claimed that we think that machines only do what we ask them to do, right? And we think organs only do one thing. The stomach is to digest your food, the lungs to breathe, bones to make you stand, right? Brain to think. But that's not the case. Organs are doing all sorts of things all the time, right? You even, if you take a fetus, implant it in rabbit somewhere else in the intestines start working as ovaries, right? So organs have this capacity to do multiple things. Bones are also producing blood, right? Skin is effusing and absorbing things. So we are kind of porous animals with these technologies and these quote-unquote functions merging and overlapping. And he said the same thing about machines. That machines too, right, also doing that. They're producing heat, they're quote-unquote breaking down. Even when they're sitting there doing something, they're talking, exchanging to the universe, right? It is our narrow definition of function that prevents us from seeing these other dimensions or acknowledging. Now, I'm not saying that we should start saying the machine should be doing whatever they want to do and then aeroplanes should do whatever they want to do, right? I want my plane to take off and land where it's supposed to do. But even when, it's completely quote-unquote safe and, doing what it's supposed to do, it's also doing other things, right? All planes, fuselages are depending microscopic cracks which have to be changed, panels have to be changed over time. Instead of seeing these as failures, is to understand that technology always inhabits a secret in it. It is always talking, doing, translating, relating to larger universes, right? These larger universal forces. What our model of technology does, like this laptop, by polishing it and creating a very clean line, is to deny that relationship and produces an idea of technology as control instead of idea of technology as relation, right? And what this model and what this woman's photograph actually is Cartier-Bresson, who's a French photographer, and in the reprint of Canguilheim's article, they use that. They're not trying to do that. They're trying to show that machine is precise, and this Chinese woman, to exoticize her, they're trying to, understand technology, and this is a sort of encounter of contrast, right? But if you read the Canguilhem article, the ambiguity inherent in the organism is also inherent in the machine, and it is a continuity. So from that sense, the donkey is not just sitting eating grass, right? Donkey itself is a technology. And certainly the mule itself is a technology. It was developed very specifically, right, for specific purpose to carry weight. What is doing this machine on top of another machine? And they are talking to each other, communicating to do another purpose. There is no contradiction there. This is not machine not working. It's just working in a different way, right? So there is no contrast between abstract knowledge and embodied knowledge. The abstract knowledge always translates into embodied knowledge and connects to the world. So when the robot was brought to this memorial at the border, it is not that it is not working. In this form, in fact, it's connecting to a different history of technology, that mules were developed here, or horses, right, that we were riding, were developed by the Spanish for a specific purpose, to climb mountains and colonize, right? And then later the Incas absorbed it too, and used it. So once you start thinking of technology in this interrelated ways, yeah, not something defining singular functions, but multiple and almost unpredictable functions, then you see a set of relations of it reveals unanticipated relations. This is a moment when the word robot is mine, and actually people have told me not to use that. The engineers there were calling it a vehicle, or guanaco erex. Robot is a word drawn from, if you look at its etymology, it means slave, right? So it's slave to the function that you've assigned to it. But here it's ironic, it's a slave which is liberating, in fact, following a liberatory journey. In fact, can you turn the lights off at this moment? Because I want to point to something. So in this liberated slave, which has liberated itself from, can you turn the lights off for a second? Just over me so I can point something to the, yeah, okay. So in this expansive moment, as a machine which is connecting to the environment, there is, can you see that guanaco up on the, there's an actual guanaco up on the mountain, right? So it's merged there, and this guanaco, mechanical guanaco, and that guanaco, you know, this is came face each other related, precisely when the machine was quote unquote not working, right? It was working in a different way. It was encountering charge encounters. So every time it was rock going over a rock, right, that it couldn't climb, every time its tail wasn't spinning and beating the drum, it similarly made these connections with the human beings around them, right? So it anticipated, it invoked emotional response, it asked them to help, right? So it became more of a teaching project of teaching this machine to walk, right, and live in this environment. So once I started thinking this thing, then it was kind of a slippery slope, you know, because your mind, you're 8 hours on a horse, you're thinking, you're looking at things, and everything starts to talk to each other, and you're tired. So one of the things that you're constantly looking at is horses' behinds. So if you notice, there are those veins, you know, under its tail. You can see them more clearly here, right? So those are also a sort of a reflection of technology. Horses developed these veins. Well, first, horse itself is a technology crossbred to produce this animal which can cross, you know, these mountains, climb up these mountains. So every horse, as it climbs the different mountains, depending on how many times it has crossed, it develops these muscles, and these veins feed those muscles, right? So its physiognomy becomes an inscription of the terrain that it has crossed. We came across this landscape in which, and this is a direct quote from Alejandro, who's sitting right there. It looks like it's a mountain party, and there's that one mountain that showed up, you know, wearing a tuxedo or a t-shirt. It's like, the others are like, what are you doing? It looks odd. But it's completely been, you know, carved out by these waters, and I couldn't stop seeing the correlation between the water running through the muscles of the horse, right, and producing these, the opposite of, I guess, grooves, you know, raises on the bodies, and then on the mountain itself, right. As it turns out, Inca's word, the civilization that there, and I'm not romanticizing them, because they, as Avishak told me, were also an imperialist, stimulator developed as an imperialist organization, empire, right? But nevertheless, and we're talking about connections, Inca's word for flesh and stone was the same. As far as I could find out, it's mesa, and then there were various, you know, sort of suffix to it. But the priest's body was kind of a mesa that it rearranged according to went into the temple, and the temple body was sort of an extension of priest's body. So the relationship between flesh and the mountain, right, used the same force or same language. You rearrange the mountain, when you took something from the mountain, the stone, you were taking mountain's flesh, right? And you're putting it and rearranging it as a technology. In that way, when you breed animals for a specific purpose, you're rearranging their flesh, right? So this correlation, now I can't imagine it, right? I can't imagine a correlation between inorganic and organic and see them both not as machine, a third element, but as a continuity, right? But this project, these horses, seeing and riding them, and then once you've seen horses behind you, they're just everywhere, right? So it's like horses behind, rocks, and you're like, they're the same. And then you see more horses, and you say, oh, that horse behind, and that thing going is like a vein. But it's sort of, I'm not saying these things exist. I'm not romanticizing it. I'm not sort of mythologizing it. I'm pointing to that I know previous civilizations were able to imagine a connection or had a model of technology in which they could imagine a continuity between these poles. I don't, right? And it's completely maybe my personal association that I've made. I'm not telling you that all of you should see it. But what it points out, and what it points out to all of us, is the limit of our modern imagination. If we can't find this connection, that something has shifted, right? When we're talking about a technology that should relate, the model of technology we has is the one that is supposed to hide the other connection is making, right? It is seen as breakdown, it is seen as inefficiency, but machines can also be tools of not hiding but revealing, right? And making and connecting our different sense of ourselves, right? Our emotional sense, the sense of our embodied self, right? And through that, a connection to the environment, right? This sense was cultivated in different civilizations, and we have sort of interpreted machines to foreclose it. So I'll stop right there. Thank you so much.
Happy presentation.
I think you have to join the Zoom. I'm not sure if he's there. Kiran, do we have Aurelion in? No, he's not there. Yeah, he probably waited and left. Chale. Yeah, it's being recorded, so yeah, yeah. All right. Uh, इसको can we mute it? इसमें थोड़ा सा echo आ रहा है. हाँ. I think sound का जो button है उसको आप off कर दीजिए. For your fantastic presentations. Aurelien is no longer with us, but hopefully maybe he will join, or maybe we will, get to hear his thoughts after he sees the recording. We only have about 15 minutes for this, so I'm going to just sort of highlight some of the things that I found really striking, and then pose two questions which are very general, and then we can just have this as a conversation among ourselves. So I really appreciated some of the points that came up in everybody's presentations in general, making invisible histories and geographies visible. It's a strand that was there in, especially in Petros and Dr. Ijlal's presentations, and indirectly in Aurelien's presentation yesterday. All of you talk about situated ecologies, materials, and methodologies which must be used so that in any kind of sort of change or conservation or highlighting sort of unethical or insufficient uses or inappropriate uses of materiality or ecological measures or conservation measures or even everyday practices, such as, you mentioned the example of the goats being in the agricultural practice that is being done in Greece. That you also talk about bringing the natural into as interventions in one way or the other, whether it is Aurélion's work, where he talks about bringing the landscape and the garden into the museum, into the curatorial space, into public experience of arts. Or if you talk about, Petros, you talked about the cages, the wonderful cages that you showed, which are sort of habitations for marine life, and there's such an like a localized and very kind of jugaad, if I might use the word from yesterday, approach to very improvisatory and very low cost approach to, and very local approach to sort of conservation of marine life and preservation of marine life. You talk about critical geographies and critical cartographies and map making. It's a strand that's there in all three of your presentations, which I really, really appreciated in very different ways. Of course, Aurélien talked about it in the sense of the histories of trade and industrialization in Qatar. And Petros, you talked about it again in reference to trade relations and what you call the battle between extraction and legacy, which is there in the Aegean, but in pretty much every part of the world. And lastly, going into territories that are not our own. How might we do that? Whether we are governments, whether we are designers, whether we are educators, and the ethics and the responsibility that goes with it. That comes in all of your work. And lastly, Ijlal, you talk about how technology is something that we have forgotten has to be relational, which is a fantastic idea, and that we expect technology to work in a way that we expect it to work. And of course, yesterday was a fantastic example of how it does never work, especially in Pakistan. So with that summary, I just want to, pose two questions, and they're very general questions, and then you can decide who should answer it or how you want to answer it, and you can also pose your own questions. So one of the questions that I have for Aurélien, he's not here, but maybe Ijlal, you can answer for him, is that when you talk about the display of arts, in the context of a museum setting, the museum setting in the global south generally is a very sort of kind of a colonial idea, if I might say. It's something which is associated in terms of viewership and access to elitism. So Qatar is a place where you also have, migrant workers. You might not have people migrating there, like the migrant crisis that happened in Europe. But how do you, the question that I have is that making all these really gorgeous spaces as architects and urban planners and, who are clearly very, very conscious about the need to be inclusive, how do you imagine, the inclusion of different kinds of viewers and publics into these experiences? That's one question, and related to that, it is also a broader question of how might some of these fantastic points that you're all bringing up in your work, in the context of Pakistan, because we are here and our students are over here, how do you take this into public discourse? And if you have any ideas on that. And this is a very general sort of series of questions. You're welcome to pose your own as well. And anyone can take them.
Perhaps we had a very perceptive question, very perceptive framing. I'll just, won't take time, just reiterate from what I remember from it, a conversation with Aurélien when, over the phone talking about the panel and what, themes might. So this was a question that, what as he's designing or curating, imagining what kind of curations go in. So that class, the access to art is associated with class, and they're hoping that they can invert that relationship, that the only purpose, create sort of moments of interaction with the audience. So it's not just you go to the museum just to see art. there should be gardens that penetrate sort of the ground floor, which are free, right? So they're experimenting with architectural design, so people can just come and hang out in the garden, right? So this, he was saying that they are workers. Yes, they are workers who live in working camps, but there are also a lot of technicians, they're nurses, they're all sorts of employed workers that make up this population, which have families there as well, right? So I mean, there is a different crisis of those workers whose families are who are not allowed to bring the families, right? So they're not claiming that museum or art can solve that problem immediately, but at least to give the distinction or the differences between the higher class spaces of art and culture and the more middle class or lower class which exist in the UAE. Perhaps institutions like that they come, to have a picnic in the garden, and then there's going to be a desert scape, sort of like an image of a desert on the rooftop, so they can access the roof and that, right? And then maybe they see that, okay, there's something of interest for them, for the children, that it can start to access. So that would I remember from his program conversation, and I thought I'd mention it. If he hears it, I hope I'm not construing it too off top. Petros, would you like to, the question of public discourse?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think to me it's a very simple answer, and it's the museum as a public space. We had a similar problem in Athens. We were working with the National Museum of Contemporary Art, which is perceived as this sort of giant building in the middle of the city, and you approach the building and you don't know how to enter, almost. And what we told the museum director, we're working on a strategic design with this, is open the doors. Make sure the doors are open. Make sure the doors that are to the north of the building can be open because they're near to the center of the city. And then start treating as many spaces within the building as public spaces, spaces that maybe do not necessarily need a ticket, or program the museum in such a way so that activities can happen. And then the flip side to that is really what we saw yesterday in the city. The museum went to the city, and that's a really hard project to do. I know because I've done it in a couple of other cities in the world. And I think for the short while it lives, it's very special. Because we weren't the only ones there, the guests and the artists. I think there were a lot of kids playing, and so I think that's that's the role. And I don't know if there's a goal or if it's to educate, but public space, I think in itself is a goal, for sure. Yeah.
No, that. I was going to say the idea of jugaad and public discourse. I mean, that was evident yesterday, and that was just incredibly impressive. Okay, it was incredibly impressive and successful. I mean, so we were taken by, even as a group, by other people, muralists who were like, I have done this street. Would you mind going over? Who were not associated with the exhibition as such. So you get to see that people, there's a certain idea of when you go into these neighborhoods, that this is the only way to bring art. What the exhibitions yesterday was doing, that there's already art there, right? So we are only surfacing them, and it creates a dialogue, and people sort of have aesthetic practices, and it's not that they don't have aesthetic aspirations. So you're creating and surfacing this dialogue, so it was, making it public that way.
And your second question was about impact, I think, or? To me, I think it's about picking projects that can have an impact. There are certain projects that are impossible, and we're conditioned to thinking that we need to kind of do these great projects, these grand projects. For me, again, the Archipelago Institute project is a project that is very limited. It's even the idea of the island that we're rejuvenating is just one place in the world. But if we do it right, then this thing can happen elsewhere. Or the idea of the sanctuary. So to me, I think it's so key. You almost have to design your own project. And I had the privilege to kind of be able to set it up from the beginning. Often you get into a relationship where the roles are very specific. As an architect, you have a client, you have a contract, you have different laws you have to abide to. But in this case, I think picking a project that is doable, that has a limit, and that can somehow be a billboard, be a kind of argue for itself as a project, I think is also very important.
Sure, that is important, but I was just thinking not in terms of impact on the public itself, but public policy. And so I think your example of your Aegean Marine Conservatory project is really important. And if you could say more about how you took on board public bodies, such as you said that you need environmental permission, and there was these practices, dubious practices of like goats being let loose on these islets. So what was the ways in which architects, scientists, whoever was involved in your project, how did they interact with those? Because remember, we don't have a lot of museums here or resources to do these kinds of projects.
I think I really like working with lawyers. I think lawyers are really smart people. I respect them very much in the way they are able to help me understand the policy, or if and or a very slight distinction between words might be a disaster. So I think you need to have teams with experts who each knows what they're doing in order to be able to have an impact. I was going to send it last night. I have 2 letters ready, one to the regional governor of the East Aegean and one to the mayor of the islands. We've been working on these letters for a long time. They're letters of intent. I think it's a better idea to send it on a Monday morning, not on a Friday night, so I'm going to send it on the Monday morning. And we've been working on these letters now for 6 months, but they're going out. We've already spoken to the municipal authorities, but they want the documentation to allow us access. So you have to also develop relationships. You have to go and knock at people's doors and find people who are willing to listen to you. The other role, for me, the other role is the render. You have to make an image that can immediately show it to others, and I think this communication skill and this way to visualize things as a designer is something that our friends and partners can also use to advocate for a project. Even if the project doesn't happen exactly as we rendered it, it doesn't matter. And it's not a render, it's an image that we make, but I think that's very important because it helps others visualize what this project can be. So I think that is also quite impactful. I don't know, it's not so much about planetary geographies, but...
No, in a sense that the way you're talking about design, it is a geography, right? You're talking about professional geography, if you want to call them. That the architects get decentered. It's not a top-down model, right? So it's all a series of collaborations and series of surprises, right? But that is a different kind. And agents, right, from fish and mammals who are also involved in doing their own thing, right?
And basically you have to step outside and say, look, actually I don't know. Let me listen. Let me see what these guys are telling me, because their knowledge is excessive, is very impressive. I wanted to say one more thing, that I forgot to finish. There was one last part in my lecture that was about rocks. And there's 2 terms for rocks in the way they're used in building and in the way that we read them in ancient Greek. One of them is a slow rock or a slow stone, argos lithos, which is basically the inert matter that you use as a kind of filling for a base. And then the other one is living rock, which is the rock that actually speaks and has agency and has been sculpted or put together in a way so that it sends a message and it performs. So this was we have to share some words.
It wasn't just me.
He's onto something. He's not hallucinating.
I'm not
on the
hallucinating.
Top of the horse.
I wasn't on the horse for too long. All things I had suspicions about. But I mean, time is so short, so I would, if it's okay with you, if you have any questions from the audience, please. Yesterday's projects, Orleans projects, or today's projects, if anyone want to raise a question.
What happened to the robot?
What happened to the robot? Oh, I'm sorry. There's a question. It's sitting. It's going to move around from gallery to gallery. I think there will be shows, and then I want to bring it to, maybe we can cross our border between India and Pakistan and see what happens.
Good luck with that.
My question is basically about your realization when you said that we build these shelters that are thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then we saw that it was 5 hours.
well, I was working to 3 universities before, and the last university I went to, I had the possibility to actually connect with this institution. I had the possibility also to say, okay, I'm going to shift my work to be able to connect. So on the one hand, it was very much a criticism of the kind of the institutional and, let's say, Western way of thinking, because these are two completely different institutions. I mean, these guys are commandos. They're out in the sea. They're trying to find solutions on the fly. They have a very different way of thinking. Most of them are sailors, actually, and sailors are amazing because they build everything. So that's really challenging for an architect. When they want to like design your own design, it's a nightmare. But we are friends. We got along, and we were able to collaborate and kind of see each other's point of view. So yeah, I think you have to question your own institutions, but I don't think I would have been able to do this project without my institution. So I think it's also about criticality and kind of recognizing that there's limits to how you think. To me, the other thing about the sanctuary is you can go swimming there, and it feels different than any other place you're swimming in the East Aegean Sea. It's working. The animals there, the small animals, they're happy. There's like octopuses that come up and sit next to you, and they're not afraid. So it's an incredible environment. They actually achieved it. And the biggest problem is actually for when there's various pleasure boats that want to come in, and they're like, oh, we want to see the dolphins. Where are the dolphins? We're like, no, that's not the idea. You cannot do that. They're not for show. This is for that. But yeah, I think institutions have their limits, and the way we also have learned how to work have their limits. And I agree, this is a form of jugar. Yeah. I think we have to keep us on our toes and keep questioning the methods we've put in place in order to get things done, for sure.
Thank you. No?
All right, thank you so much.
I really liked your summary, actually. I want to take notes from it.
Thank you so much, distinguished speakers. A very insightful discussion indeed. Introducing our next panel for today, Design as Translation, led by Tahira Naqvi, Rehan Ansari, Mariah Rusuk, and chaired by Avishek Ganguly. I will be introducing them one by one. Avishek Ganguly is an interdisciplinary scholar who delves into translation, theater, performance, cultural studies, and contemporary English literature. With teaching experience at Columbia and University of Delhi, he received the 2020 John R. Fraser Award for Teaching Excellence. Ganguly advocates for using interdisciplinary humanities to inform public discourse and policy discussions on contemporary social issues. Next, Rehan Ansari. Rehan is a Brooklyn-based filmmaker, playwright, and a journalist. Currently, he's directing and producing a feature nonfiction film, The Return, alongside Anjali Kamath. Ansari's play, Unburdened, has been staged in New York, Mumbai, and Prague. With a background as a foreign editor at Daily News and Analysis and editor at Independent Press Association, New York, Ansari brings diverse experiences to his creative endeavors. Next panelist, Mariah Rusak, an ETH postdoctoral fellow at the Chair of the History and Theory of Urban Design, Zurich. She's researching the impact of Nordic architecture on foreign aid in post-colonial Africa, focusing on the economic rationale behind architectural production. Mariah holds a PhD from the Oslo School of Architecture and Design and Mariah holds a PhD from the Oslo School of Architecture and Design and an MA Architecture from KTH Sweden and a BA from Princeton University, USA. May I please request the panelists to take the seats? Thank you.
हेलो एंड अस्सलाम वालेकुम एवरीवन। मैं हूं आपकी आज की होस्ट ज़ैनब हमीद।
हेलो एंड अस्सलाम वालेकुम एवरीवन। मैं हूं आपकी होस्ट राबेल फातिमा जैदी with yet another exciting episode of the Chit Chat।
अस्सलाम वालेकुम नाज़रीन, BNU बुलेटिन में खुशामदीद। मैं हूं तस्मिया मनाज़िर।
अस्सलाम वालेकुम, मैं हूं राबेल फातिमा जैदी
और मैं हूं रिजा सुल्तान।
BNU बुलेटिन में खुशामदीद। मैं हूं शारफा शहजाद।
कैमरामैन शेर वाजिद के साथ लाइबा जफर, BNU न्यूज़ लाहौर।
कैमरा पर्सन अमारा वलीद के साथ रमशा शहजाद, BNU।
I know it's been a long day and long but very exciting series of events. So thank you for being here. I will just start us off with a couple of just a basic couple of framing sentences. Can you all hear me at the back everywhere? Yeah. So I'll just say a couple of framing sentences and then we'll start with our presentations. So. I was thinking, looking back at all the absolutely wonderful presentations, papers, exhibitions, installations, and I was thinking that we seem to have been, we've been thinking about something as design, X as design, Y as design, Z as design, and when I looked at our panel, I felt like we were talking about design as something. Right? So in this case, design as translation. So it's kind of this opportunity to think through and think with, about design, but being modeling it on or modeling it after different other practices or, forms. So, we'll talk a little more after we're all done. We have an interesting mix of presentations. Rehan, who's going to go first. Rehan, you're going to do something? You're going to perform? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So we'll start with that, and then Maria will go after with a presentation, and I guess mine will be also a presentation. So are we good to go?
Sure.
So we'll wait, let's aim for 12 minutes, and then if we have time, have a discussion after that.
This is great, I can just... Okay. So I have a prop, which are these jutas. Now, I hope that whatever this gesture means right now is not what it will mean at the end of the talk. Like, this is pretty rude. And let's hope that I can make you think about something else by the end of the 10 minutes. So translation is also what you feel like doing when you're not satisfied with what there is. Or you badly want to share what you're feeling. You have to translate it. There's no way around it. So about 25 years ago, when I was about 25, in this city, I used to write a column called I Love Nawaz Sharif. Why love? Why did I call it love? And why Nawaz Sharif? Is because I thought I was a failure at love at 25. And Nawaz Sharif was my only option. So translation is also doing something in the present that is about something in the past, hoping or determined for a different outcome. By the way, it's fine to laugh or hoot or moan or groan, say no or yes, as long as you're under 30. So it's too bad Rashid Rana is not around, because he knew me then, and he's already preemptively critiqued this talk without listening to it by saying, Rehan, you're doing a rerun. I'm just going to talk about what I've always talked about. And we have seen this film before. But there's a film that I am making. I do admit I'm releasing it late. It is about all of this. The film is called The Return. My co-director is Anjali Kamath, It's being produced by Auburn Pictures out of New York. It's going to be 100 minutes non-fiction. I've just got a finer cut of it. Towards the end, I may show a few minutes of it. It will come across, our ambition is that it'll come across as a thriller. It's non-fiction, but it's a thrill. It's like a thriller from the 70s. Like All the President's Men, 3 Days of the Condor. I don't know if you know these movies, but they're my favorite. Anyway, with I Love Nawaz Sharif, I used to write about my encounter with Lahore and its ghosts. And Akar Patel in Mumbai, then editor Midday, read it online and wrote me a message saying, translate what you're saying about this Lahore you're writing about and your encounter with it for a Mumbai audience. So, I used to translate Pakistan for an Indian audience. With this film, I'm claiming that one thing I'll be doing is translating India for a Pakistani audience. For example, I'll translate Shaheen Bagh for you and what I call the graduates of Shaheen Bagh. It's a protest movement you might have heard about and should know more about. Sometimes translation moves people to cross borders. Akar became a friend. Reading me, he became a friend. We had never met. He came to Lahore to see who I was talking about. He met my Khalu, Ifti, whose shoes these are. He met Khalid Ahmed. He met my friends from the Frontier Post. This is from the Frontier Post of the early 90s. I showed him Lakshmi Mansions and those who lived there, especially that one writer, Lahore loves to name, you know him, the script writer who moved from Bombay, never to work in a film again. So I claim for Akar that some idea of dissidence rubbed off on him, because look at him now. You should look him up. A translator should get more credit than is due. And also you should suspend your belief when dealing with a translator. It could be true, you know, the meaning they're asserting. But to make it come true, what you have felt, you have to believe it. You can't stand on the fence. There's a scene in this film where Anjali, my collaborator, is arranging my archive on her desk in New York. It's my going to India from Lahore and my in India writing about Pakistan and vice versa. And in the archive are photographs. There's one of me with M.S. Gill. I was close to him and his family for a couple of years, and we used to sit in Nizamuddin East 2 Sundays a month for 2 years. And I would ask him what exactly are elections in India, because he was twice chief election commissioner. And he used to answer with monologues about why Punjab keeps getting divided. We translated ideas to each other. These images in the film for Anjali translated into a line which she said to me that she thinks I moved to Lahore to be in India. Now, why would I do that? And what on earth could be that design? So, personal favorite attribute of translation that I have, an attribute of translation, is going for a new design. The original text is your first principles, inspiration. The reading of it is your history with the text, but translating, you're doing something new. I'll give an example. Like Arvind Kumar Mehrotra of Allahabad translated Kabir. He's a poet. And it came out as if Kabir wrote like Allen Ginsberg. He found only one reader for this translation. But the reader is Elliot Weinberger, this amazing poet in New York. Not bad. Arvind has also said that Pakistanis don't translate Kabir. I wonder if that's true. I wanted to ask this in the audience. I still don't know the answer. Anyway, translating Lahore and Pakistan got me to India, and I began to live there. So both sides of my family have been driven out. So that's why I went. Why stay bounded by the text? Why stay completely bounded by the text? So this juta belongs to my Khalu Ifti, who he's passed. He used to be he was my army officer uncle, a serving officer, serving officer when he suggested to me that I should visit India. He served in 2 wars, Armored Corps, which is not a joke, during combat. He said to me when I came to Pakistan after years in college in New York, before you head back to the West, why don't you go east? He meant India. That became a relationship with him. For 2 decades, I would do stints away from the Eurocentrism of New York and the West and come to Lahore to stay with him. And then I would go to India and tell him stories about it. I've recently realized I was balancing out Eurocentrism with the ghosts of Lahore, so not even the real city. I would go to India and translate it for him. What I saw, who I met, who I should meet, how are they different, how are we, what happened, what can happen, what we can hope can happen. So how did I get this juta? So in Gymkhana, I'm staying in Gymkhana, they said I'm wearing these sneakers and I've got to wear shoes. So his nephew, who's my size, I thought he'd have my size, he brought this juta without telling me whose they are. And they fit. So that's how I happened to, I thought this was a sign that I should have this juta in the presentation. Another attribute of translation. There are subjective and private meanings in translation when you know both languages. Kind of like how I know both India and Pakistan. It's a kind of meaning that has lyricism. It wants to win over an audience. I want to make this an ex-private translation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rehan. That was very, very moving.
I think I ambushed the whole...
No, we'll see how it goes. You never know with translation. So, yeah.
Excellent. Hello, and I will continue. Yes, I will continue with a quite literary topic. My talk is called A Tale of a Water Heater, a Typewriter, and Two Bank Accounts. And as was mentioned, I'm actually a postdoctoral fellow, and I work with a project on transnational design projects. So I think this fits quite well with my interests. So today I'm going to tell you 3 short stories, and hopefully, with their help, make a point about design as translation. I'm particularly interested in the not-so-obvious hidden details of how designs are translated across cultural and geographical contexts, and the way often overlooked objects facilitate and impact it. There will be a lot more questions than answers, but I hope maybe it will give us some thought for discussion. So, the first tale, it's a story of a travel of quite a not very often thought about object, a water heater, which traveled all the way from Norway to Zambia in the hope of being installed as a part of a large Norwegian school project in Zambia. And a letter from the archives dated August 30, 1977, from one of the project managers reads as follows. Dear Uncle Leif, once upon a time, there was a famous water heater sent from Norway, where it was made, to Zambia. It traveled first on a ship, then on a railway, and finally on a big truck, all the way from Oslo to Livingstone. It had to be a big truck, as it was a very big water heater. I first heard about the water heater when I joined the Wild Bank project in August 1973. It had already become famous, not simply due to its size, but because it had taken 2 years to reach Hillcrest Livingstone. I think it got lost somewhere in Angola, was a year on the railway sequence. There was a great excitement when it finally arrived and was offloaded from the track. It looked a little bit battered, which was natural after such a long and arduous trip, but proudly displaying the Norwegian flag. However, when the engineer and the builder tried to fit it in to the design position, which was horizontal on top of the roof of the kitchen, they discovered that it was designed to be fixed upright. Well, it was too big to fit at the top of the sloping roof, so they thought and pondered and eventually decided that it would have to go inside the store instead of on top of the roof. Again, most unfortunately, the door was too small to get the water heater through, so there was nothing for it but to take the roof off, and so they did, and after much puffing and blowing and huffing, they got it safe inside. So the letter is quite long, and it goes on to describe the many trials and tribulations faced by just one object in a much larger school building project, which envisioned constructing of more than 50 secondary schools in Zambia. Financed by the World Bank and the Norwegian government, it was designed and administered by a Norwegian design team in the 1970s. However, as the anxious tone of the letter reveals, the project faced many, many difficulties on its way of getting there. Indeed, projects of foreign aid were often administered by teams of people across national domains, were separated not just by thousands of kilometers, but also by miles of cultural differences and ideas. Often they were planned by teams of architects and designers thousands of kilometers away, who flew into the place for the first time and then executed by local contractors and local teams of workers who had a very different way of working. For example, the infamous water boiler traveled some 12,800 kilometers by ground and has been a problem for hundreds of people, both in Zambia, in Norway, in the United States, and in other different places around the world. And here you can actually see the water boiler and how it looked, and the small lamentation about how it never actually worked. So, of course, the story is not really so much a story of a water heater, but a story of a much larger narrative to which the history of the boiler is just a proxy. Why do water heaters need to travel such a long distance? What happens when an object designed in one place is then replaced or misplaced to an entirely different context? What happens when with the act of design, when the design and application of the object are separated by distance of no less half of the globe? In my real life, I'm not a designer, but an architectural historian who works in places like this, and mostly with documents that look like this. and this, and this. It doesn't really look very exciting, but I do believe that very small details and very traceable storylines offer unique insights into the thinking process behind design. So, for example, the documentation for the Zambia School project also includes many other instructional materials and installation manuals, providing information on how new devices should work and how they should be maintained. Overall, design manuals are of course quite interesting, but also problematic artifacts, which allow a unique insight into the thinking process behind design. I was then particularly interested in the detailed explanations of drawings and instruction text which accompany technological objects which were to be transferred and translated to a different context. Seemingly innocent, they seem to communicate neutral information on how the object is to work. However, they also presuppose a certain image of the world, of the right and the wrong way of using things and technology. With claims like easy installation and easy maintenance, they immediately chart a picture of the world from a certain angle and viewpoint, and a strict hierarchy between those who have the knowledge and those who don't, those who design and those who are designed for. These manuals and instructional drawings have little consideration for the implicit and tacit knowledge which is already there, and very little understanding of the context in which these objects are to be used. This becomes particularly interesting with the questions of maintenance. For example, the Zambian school project could not be completed until a long-term strategy for maintenance was designed, but the heaters were never actually working, and there were very few people in place who knew how to install and maintain them. So how can a boiler shipped from Norway to Zambia adequately respond to the needs and the context of a rural school project? What happens when these objects arrive on site, and what happens with the gaps that are created in the translation? Who is to fill these gaps and gray areas, and how do they leave space for creative appropriation? What is the role of designers of these objects, and how would they fare if they face the actual lived reality of their objects? So this brings me to my second tale, which will be shorter. It's called The Missing Letters. In 1978, a newly hired Norwegian functionary in Nairobi, Kenya, came to the post office to collect his paycheck. However, he soon discovered that the paycheck could not be collected since his name was not in the registry. After some back and forth with different administration people, it turned out that he could not collect his paycheck because the typewriter in his salary office, which printed the pay slips, lacked the one specific Norwegian letter that was in his name. Instead, the letter was substituted with a combination of other letters, which eventually did not match the spelling on his ID, and thus could not be found by alphabetized sorting. In a way, the bureaucratic apparatus of the two nation-states involved in the process clashed and overlapped with each other. The Kenyan typewriters, inherited from the British colonial rule, were not prepared to process the Norwegian names, who also had no business of being there, and the insistence on the ID checks made it impossible for the money exchange being moved in the first place from Norway to Kenya to take place. The short anecdote reveals the bigger role which instruments of bureaucracy play in shaping their transnational design projects. Typed documents, seemingly innocent, unaggressive, and unimportant, in fact occupied a crucial role in such projects. Each decision was accompanied by heaps of documents which traveled between Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, Lusaka, Copenhagen, Oslo, and Stockholm, with stopovers ranging from Washington and New York to Paris, Geneva, Cairo, and Istanbul. In fact, thousands of hundreds of letters were shipped and airplaned across the world, stopped in their tracks, intercepted by telegrams, cross-wired by urgent telexes and rarely phone calls, and often lost in translation. Telexes and telegrams regulated and directed design process, conveyed decisions, provided advice, issued corrections and ultimatums, and regimented the time of design. From state agreements to tax exemption treaties, these documents moved objects, people, and large sums of money, and were some of the most powerful means of control. Typewritten documents regulated not only the flow of people, but also work regimes and routines, design work and break time. And actually, you can see a curious document here regulating the time of taking tea. So I'm particularly interested in these bureaucratic documents and the typos in these documents that reveal very different visions of the world. So this innocent typos, mistakes, inconveniences, incongruences betray the processes of cultural, political, social, and economic translation. And I will briefly skip to the last part. So, double banked. The two previous interests lead me to the very last story of the talk, that of the two bank accounts, and in general, the doubling effect of things in the transnational design ventures. In 1969, the two Norwegian architects designing now a Tanzanian school project requested the Tanzanian government to split the bill in two parts, one in Tanzanian shillings, which could be collected within the country, and one in Norwegian kroners, which can be withdrawn at the Norwegian National Bank. This arrangement, to a large extent, was conditioned by the limited liquidity of the Tanzanian shilling, a situation quite obvious for a newly independent state, and the extensive design opportunities for a Norwegian firm in Tanzania. Indeed, the financial gains and new contacts gained from the state projects, the Norwegian architects set up a successful design office in Tanzania. This situation of doubling accounts was actually not very unusual. The Tanzanian national state, for example, had its own bank account in the National Bank of Norway, withdrawing funds allocated by the Global Lending Organization in Norwegian kroners as necessary. These transnational projects of the 1960s posed, in fact, a complicated problem of financial translation, as they were often financed by a range of different bodies and within circumstances of inflation. This doubling financial translation was an attempt to mitigate the financial risks embedded in transnational design projects. However, how to integrate inflation into design work, which spans several years, and inflation situation which can accelerate at any moment. So financial translation offers perhaps the most direct parallel to design in translation in international design ventures. It provides a very concrete entry point to the question of design as translation. How can financial contingencies be incorporated into the design process and design thinking? What spaces do they create, and how can, once again, these spaces be occupied in a creative way? So, to conclude, I wanted to convey the fact that these transnational design projects, often conveyed in one part of the world and administered in another, are often impacted by a really wide range of factors that complicate the idea of design as translation. Concrete artifacts maintain, mediate, permeate, and translate implicit and explicit power structures, and these power structures accumulate over time in many layers, having a very tangible impact on design of objects and buildings and the lives of people within them. Often, these implicit power structures create ruptures, overlaps, creases, and voids, and these gray zones could be filled with creative solutions. So, what are the strategies for their creative occupation then? Who's better suited to design for a specific context? And what is the fate of these transnational design projects then? Can design conventions maintained in one place be translated to another? Who is to design and for whom? With this talk, I really wanted to encourage you to think about the agency of the mundane, often invisible artifacts that harbor a lot of power structures and profoundly impact the process of design, from typewriters to standardized paper dimensions. The transnational design projects often offer a particular moment of overlap, of simultaneity, where objects from one side of the world travel to a different side of the world, governed by a different set of rules and conventions. In reality, these objects and design projects are often misplaced, displaced, and very rarely actually placed. So thank you.
Can you just connect this thing to go? Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So, hi again, everybody, and I'm Abhishek Ganguly, as you know from the introduction. I'll say a few things before I actually get to my presentation. First, I just, wanted to say thank you to my hosts, BNU, for making it possible for me to be here. But I would want to name at least a couple of people who have been, very, very instrumental in me standing in front of you and actually talking to you today. One, the wonderful team at BNU, but Professor Kiran Khan, and thank you, Kiran, for doing all the work you did behind the scenes, and my good friend Ijlal, who has been instrumental in both literal and figurative senses to make not just this whole wonderful thing happen, but also, again, for me to be, to be able to be here. And then the other thing, so I know I'm thrilled, I'm very happy, but I'm also very grateful to be speaking to you. We've been, the panels before me have invoked grandmothers and borders. So I wanted to also remember my own grandmother-in-law, my wife's grandmother, who was born in the 1920s in the undivided subcontinent in what was East Bengal, lived most of her life in what became India, and then always wanted to travel to Lahore. So when the friendship bus started in 1999, we spoke about if we could come together at some point. She lived till the ripe old age of 96 and then passed away a couple of years ago. But here I am. So that's so as I said, I'm very grateful to be here. It's a privilege. Now, both a good and a bad thing about being the last panel in some sense of the day is that you wonder if many things you're going to say have been said, and I'm dare I say for all three of us. But then we have seen that design and translation has been evoked multiple times through the last day or two. So, which kind of makes us feel, I guess, if I can again speak for all of us, that we are onto something. So we're also not worried that everything that we had to say has been said. So we might still, the conversation is still to be had. So, design and as translation, the name of the panel is also the name of my presentation. And what I would do is, I think I'll try to kind of offer I'm always, my base discipline when I started what I do now was literature. So there was a lot of reading and writing and texts. So I'm very jealous when I'm at these venues where with these artists and designers and they're very cool presentations with lots of cool slides and pictures. And when we do these things, we do the visual thing, we pretend to, but we also put a chunk of text on the screen. That is our version of trying to do slideshows, and then we read them. So I'll do less show, more tell, so please bear with me. And what I'll do is I'll just offer probably, what I have is a snapshot of what, how I've been thinking. My work has been changing, evolving, in conversation with colleagues here, but also elsewhere, and then kind of little examples of things I've been doing, and then end with, as Maria said, more questions than answers, hopefully, and some kind of speculative ideas. So the kind of general thing that I want to say is that thinking about translation for a long time now, almost a decade, I have, in fact, started to do the opposite thing, which is try to explore what is it to move away from the most obvious idea of translation that we know, right? Which is that it's an act of linguistic transfer, linguistic exchange, textual, literary, mostly written, right? So, because that's where I started from. So for me, the fun was to kind of move away from it and see how long it still stays what we are calling it translation. So I like that how, you, my fellow panelists, were working with text. So, and so I'll try to kind of, do a little bit of that. So a quick sense of, can you see the thing with the light on, more or less? Okay, a kind of quick sense of where I was or am or going. Translation across media is, largely where I am at. Yes, thank you. Theater and performance, it has been one way to extend the thinking on translation, performance, not just being, performance in the way we know, but performance as a frame, as a kind of conceptual, philosophical frame to think about things like translation, design, and the kind of conversation with design and the humanities. I mean, I teach the humanities at an art and design school, so two artists and designers, so that's a conversation, so a lot of this is coming from there. The topic of global Englishes comes from that, again, thinking about English, the language, the larger life of the language, in kind of across expanded media and everyday life. That takes me to thinking about things like voice and accent and speech, so, sound, listening, so sound and the kind of larger frames of post-colonialism, decolonization, globalization, which many of us here engage with. These are all frames which sometimes they do or they do not contain what we do. So that's kind of, and those are just a couple of works that are relevant to, those are co-edited things that I've been fortunate to work with colleagues putting together some of this work out in the world. This is a little more of the same, again touching on where I'm coming from. This is an interview with Raqs Media Collective, a Delhi-based artist collective, very well known, I believe. Did an interview with them about invoking the translator. That's a snapshot of a work, one of their very well-known takeaway pieces that they did. It's kind of hand-cut. If you were at the event in the galleries, then you would walk home away with one of those pieces. It's I don't know if you can see, it has a phrase in Urdu from Faiz, it has a phrase in English from Aga Shahid Ali, and a phrase from Tagore in Bengali. And it talks about ideas of translation and borders and neighborliness and, both things that translate and things that don't, something that Rehan was very evocatively talking about. So that's one thing, a little bit of, talking about the ideas of planetarity that Ijlal has kind of made front and center in the conversations here. So relationships with translation, again, in a thinker that, we, both of us and some of you, I guess, have been engaging with the work of Gayatri Spivak. Again, thinking about, what is it to think the planetary as opposed to the global or the worldly, this idea of the kind of the ungraspable, the unknowable. And the third slide is taking these ideas into the realm of Englishes and, where the idea that there have always been Englishes, we've always had Englishes, and kind of probing ideas of the construct of a native speaker and, all of that. So a little, just a little piece of that. I start with the work referring to the work of Rokeya Sakhawat Hossain, a Bengali writer, one of the earliest, I guess, what today we would say speculative feminist fiction writers in English. A piece she published in 1905 as a challenge to show that, to kind of show her mastery of composing fiction in English. So, so this is kind of a little part of the large sort of groundwork from where I'm coming, I guess. So, we all have a shared idea of translation as I said, the conventional dominant idea of it being a literary process, a practice, an act, working primarily between named languages, right? So to continue the rethinking idea, the idea of translation across media, so that took me to thinking about how does translation work across, let's say, questions of embodiment that we were talking about, right? What do embodied translation look like? And the question that Ijlal very, very powerfully posed with technology, with the translation from the abstract to the embodied, right? How do we think about that when we're talking about that, when we talk about sound, when we talk about gesture, about movement, about the digital? So, so it's kind of taking off from thinking about translation as textual, going towards all of that. The second way I've been thinking about this is translation as not just a literary act, but an ethical and a political act. The political, if I may say, talk about that first, it kind of builds on the idea of how translators create readers, communities of readers, right? To expand on that and think about how translation creates collectivities, right? So just not only on the page, but maybe in the world, maybe in our imaginations. So a little more of that. There's a little bit of the work I showed you deals with this. And translation as an ethical act, for instance, the idea of, again, something that has been referred, that translation doesn't quite do it. It kind of fails. It falls short. And this is an idea I'll come back to multiple times. But there is a necessity to still continue to attempt to do it, right? So what is that kind of bind, I guess? I'm thinking of double banked, but the double bind of being stuck in a place where it's necessary, but it's always falls short, right? But the necessity of continuing to doing the attempt. Translation also, becomes often an invitation to dwell in incomprehension, right? Not everything translates. We are often in the presence of situations where translation is being staged or is happening where we don't get everything, especially if we belong to hegemonic language communities where we are, and it could be different languages in different contexts, where we are used to getting things and we don't get them. What do we do? Then do we give up? Do we just leave the place? Do we walk out? Or do we continue to engage while knowing that we'll not be able to know everything all the time, right? So it's almost an exercise in humility in some sense, so that's that. And then translation as a creative and not a derivative practice, right? The fact that, again, translation is thought of as a loss. It's not an original thing. It's always secondary. It's a derived. So putting a little more pressure on the idea that translation is also creative. It creates a new relation to the text that has gone before. I would say translation, I'm not the first person to say, translation kind of retrospectively creates the notion of an original. Before there is a translation, we are unsure about what went before, what was the original, right? So translation in kind of retrospectively gives us the concept of original as that which went before, right? So there's that, and politically creative, ethically creative. So that, and continuing this, what are the implications of thinking? As I said, some of these, not just, the idea of not just being lost in translation, but also being constantly constituted by it, across all kinds of boundaries, borders, but also in our neighborhoods, in everyday life. The idea of simultaneity has been thought about very interestingly across the last couple of days. So translation is simultaneously not just a lack, but it always generates excess, right? So it's not and or, it's neither nor. That's the kind of, it's neither a lack nor an excess, it's always both. So I was thinking about the conversations I was having with some colleagues from BNU about, just the spelling of the word jugaad yesterday. You often see it, in the Indian context, I have seen it spelled with a D at the end, Jugaad, and then you're working with R, and and it's not a loss, it's not a gain, maybe it's a gain, I would say, it's not a loss, but it's a different relationships, it's a proliferation of meanings, right? That why not also throw that in and see what is lost? So, what is gained in that? What do we get? What more adds to it? So there's that. And as I said, translation across sound and embodiment and graphic and digital and that. So now to kind of quickly move into the interface with design, does design translate, right? And I have a kind of obvious examples, more graphic design, I guess. This is the traffic sign in Welsh. This is self-evident. This is New Zealand, kind of Maori English, So does translation, does design translate? Two ways to think about it, and again, I'd love to talk more about this if you have questions. One is the obvious, does design translate between things, right? I'm calling it, I'll come to that slide, I'm just looking at the watch, between the so-called the user and the used. As an interaction between, but also does design translate? Are we able to understand design in terms of anything that is not design, right? So kind of bringing us close to the idea of untranslatability. Is design untranslatable? No, there are untranslatable things, right? So in that sense, does design translate? The answer is maybe no. We can try, but we cannot understand it in terms of something else. And the obvious one between these two. I will throw in my last slide, though. Does design translate? This is a picture of a very happy Afghan child who is a huge fan of Lionel Messi, the soccer football fan. He wanted to wear the soccer jersey, football jersey. His older brother made that for him. That is available, that was a found object, a blue and white plastic bag, right, which you all recognize, and then wrote the numbers 10 on it and made him very happy. And you can see how it might work, right? So, so far so good. But then, these are the two things I said. But now the last bit is, can design translate? Right? And I'll leave you with this text a little bit. This is an excerpt from a very powerful book by the Mexican-American author Valeria Luiselli. This is a kind of, she worked as an interpreter for undocumented children, often Spanish-speaking, but not just Spanish-speaking, who would come across the US-Mexico border and would show up in these immigration courts, mostly in New York, and they would need volunteers to translate for these children, right? I'm talking about 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds, unaccompanied minors. And she would talk to them, interpret them so that, their legal cases get sorted in the ways one would want them to be. And then this is an excerpt from her talking to one of these kids, right? So this is like a 6 or a 7-year-old girl. And the idea that before they would leave, a grandmother, again, while we are on grandmothers, would sew a 10-digit telephone number on the collars of the dress of these girls, right? So I had a very interesting conversation in the context of craft and sewing and, when we talked about this. So what does it mean to do this, to sew this in the collar of these girls who would just go across the border, and if they're lost, which the idea was to almost get lost so that they can be found by American immigration, and then they show this to the policeman, and the idea was that they would then be placed where they would want to be fled. So how do we, what is the translation? What is this, what's happening here? What is, that's what I said, I don't know. Can it translate everything that is at stake here? We come back to the ethical in some sense, right? It's a book that I would highly recommend. It's a slim volume. You should read it. So this is that. So the children would not know English, they would just have this. So this is a kind of, I would just leave you with a case study of sorts where I grappled with this, about, where I tried to think, designers, design researchers have thought about design as repair, or design and repair as remaking, so I kind of, speculated on that a little bit. So this is, trying to think repair after translation, the idea of necessary yet impossible, translation, also as remaking. And, these are kind of the things that I would love to leave you with for further conversation or thinking that, and some of these things, for instance, Ijlal has touched upon, but also some of the other presentations, the idea of the move from expertise to indeterminacy, that translations are never finished, never definitive. One can always produce another translation of the text that has been done. So the idea of mastery, expertise, which we talk about in context of development or technology, and translation is an invitation to dwell with uncertainty and unfinished and inadequacy. So it's a kind of an idea of cultivating a mindset. And the idea of the designer as the originally figure to the designer as a translator. So it's this kind of author-translator tension that you can see of, right? That it doesn't come necessarily from you, but you're mediating it. And what is displaced in thinking like that? And finally, an invitation to think not what is something in a kind of ontophenomenological sense, but what is it to design? What is it to translate? So again, trying to think design in terms of translation. I don't know if it works or not, but I just want to stop here and leave you with this. So thank you very much. Can you have the lights, please? Do you want to do? Yeah.
So screen आप तक दिखा दें.
So I guess Rayan is going to show the clip that he had promised us. And then we'll get to talking a little bit about it.
You know, as I think some of you know, I've already talked, and I'm just showing, without audio, a little section from the film that is almost complete that I've been working on. I'm co-directing it with Anjali Kamath. And this is a little sequence where everything is happening all at once. The film is called The Return, and it is about my collaborator Anjali going to India and dealing with the whole culture going supremacist and the idea of being a dissident. So in the film, she goes undercover at a far-right conference, as well as she talks to family members who are RSS. And throughout the film, I'm in conversation with her. For the fact that the war cry in India, the mobs often use the phrase, Pakistan ya Kabristan. Now that's very interesting to me. So I'm just showing this clip, and I call it imbroglio. It's when all of the strands are happening at the same time, and you have to decide what you must do. So I'm just going to play it for about 3 minutes. And the lights off, please, and there's no audio. That's me on the right, out of danger completely. You can have the lights back. That's it. Thank you. We can,
Okay, so thank you again. Thank you, fellow panelists. You can hear me, right? So a couple of things, I was just taking some notes when I was listening to you both. So I'll just kind of share them, and then, feel free to respond to them, and then, we can open it up to the audience. Two things, that stood out for me in how it seemed all three of us were talking about translation, was this idea of translation. One that I mentioned is kind of fraught, interesting, evolving relationship with the idea of texts and textuality, right? I mean, you're talking about writing and translating, journalism, the frame of that. Maria, you were reading the text of bureaucracy, let's say, right? Reports, telegrams, letters. So that, and the other kind of vector, and so what's that, if you wanted to talk a little more about that specific aspect of, are you stretching, kind of bending, stretching the relationship, a straightforward relationship of translation and writing, right? And the other thing is something that also came up in the previous panel, which is translation and the relationship of translation and relationality, right? The idea of relationality, both in the very specific kind of philosophical, specifically post-colonial sense, but also in terms of translation evoking relationships, fostering, creating relationships, translation revealing that we are and things are in relationships, right, with each other, and that, things, by revealing the split sometimes, by revealing lost marks and ciphers and, digits in some sense, like literally digits as in hands. So, so those two kind of broad things stood out for me. So if you wanted to talk a little more about that, or if you wanted to talk about something else that I might have missed, that's fine too. But let's, yeah, so either Maria or whoever wants to.
Yes, thank you. I think a very interesting question, because particularly in the context of architectural design or in general design, I think designers have a tendency to think that everything is communicated through drawings. But also I do find the texts very important, because I think they capture a lot more of the realities of the design work and the kind of decision making behind design work. And at least from the examples I have been working with, none of this are individual projects, and hardly ever beyond very particular artistic practices. Architecture can be an individual project. It involves so many people behind and so much decision making that I think text becomes the shared medium that a lot of things are communicated through, because there's just no other way around design but through text. And I think it's very important, and a lot of architects perhaps don't fully think about it in their own work, while this is the footprint that is left afterwards from these design projects. So I do think these textual documents reveal a lot of interesting conflicts and contingencies of what it means to translate design even from one practitioner to another, or across nation states, or across really large distances. And then, as you pointed out, I think mistakes in design and very specific instances when things are translated or mistranslated, or people speaking different languages as they work on a same project, I think reveals a lot of kind of language becomes this interface with the other. So I think it is extremely interesting to close read this text and the production of this text.
I'm just thinking about when does one realize that it's a successful translation? So in my talk earlier, some people have been coming in and out. I'd been writing for this column I had called I Love Nawaz Sharif, and I get this message from Akar saying, you're doing a good job translating Pakistan for an Indian audience. Only then did I know I'm doing a good job. So I've just been thinking about this, the not knowing part of it. Like when you yourself don't know the cipher.
Idea of the audience, right? Which is said, I mean, if we are, and also something that you mentioned, and thank you both, that I made a note, and I would, you said that, I'm kind of rephrasing you, this translation betrays a desire. A translation wants to be read, heard, I would say, seen, realized, felt. But I would say a text wants to be read, right? In that sense. So there is kind of, and our interpretation to keep the translation and the text interpretable in some sense, right? Open to be read is kind of acknowledging that desire. We may not read the text the way the text wanted to be read, but that thing. And I was thinking also, Maria, what you said about the bureaucratic, the very mundane translation, right? So much of translation, contrary to its image of being this high-minded literary pursuit, is actually very mundane and everyday and pragmatic. I mean, the large part of the translation industry, so to say, are all these manuals. I was thinking of that exploded diagram that you showed, how the thing works, right? So often, or these multilingual little packages that come with medicines in multiple languages. Mm-hmm. We don't even realize unconsciously that we are dealing with translation in so many ways. Those of us who are fortunate to fly, see all these things at airports, international airports, for instance. But manuals of instruction, how to fix up something, mobile phones, we do this intuitively, we don't probably read anymore how to do that. So there is a pragmatics. And sometimes, as Ijlal said, I want my plane to take off and land exactly where we want it to land. There's poetry, and then there is the functionality of it. But so it's important to have that, supplementing that. So, yeah, I mean, any comments you want to add, and then I'd like to open it a little bit.
Since you are here and we are here, I was thinking, that it'd be interesting if you take up this idea. I mean, I'm proposing it that India and Pakistan are two languages that need translation, because that's how I've approached it. And even like I said earlier, that even in this film, speaking in terms of a Pakistani audience, there's some interpretations that I am thinking about, interpretations of India.
Right.
And as you know, that in translation you pick and choose.
Yes.
So I'm inviting you to say something about like whether you agree that the two places are like languages.
Well, this is a kind of world historical question, weight of the question. Do we? No, I mean, at least two languages, if not more.
Right.
I'm all for
in terms
plurals.
Of the nation,
The native language in that sense. I mean, so things go over, but then as, people who have thought about this have also pointed out, but then there are things like idioms which do not go over. So, the idiom is to translation where the failure of the technology to work is to technology. It's that when you realize that it doesn't. And that's the poetry part, right? And that invites remaking, right? So, I mean, how could I not agree with what you were saying? But on the other hand, the idea of choice is very interesting because, all translation, and I think everybody takes their translation work very seriously. Translators do, and maybe it would be a good idea for translators to always preface a translation that they put out in the world with something like a note, where they tell us, the intended audience, about some of the choices that they're making. And another translator would do that differently, but it's, we're curious to know. I don't know if we expect this from the so-called original text, but when one is picking and choosing, I mean, what do you choose to translate? And then comes the question of how do you translate it? Why did you not translate it this way, or why did you do it that way? And the answer is, well, you can always do it your way, and there are endless translations. So this idea of choice is very, what do you choose to, and what are you leaving out? Right? Those gaps that, Maria, you were talking about.
But
right?
I think that's also when translation becomes design. At least to me, it seems like you are designing Lahore for the outside audience. You're definitely constructing it.
Yes.
and you're definitely constructing one image for another side. So I think with this, what you were describing, pick and choose, this is the role of designers, you pick and choose.
I mean, there's definitely one reader in the audience of mine who thinks I made it all up.
Exactly.
Like all of Lahore. So.
All cities of the mind, no?
Yeah.
Was it Calvino who said or something like that? Like all cities are cities of the mind.
Cities.
So on that lovely note, in this lovely city, we can open, if anybody has any thoughts and questions, I mean, we can continue, but it'll be great. We have a little bit of time.
No.
Yes. Yes. How do we do this?
Yes.
Please.
Please, yeah.
You and then you. Yes.
Should I start?
Yes, please.
Firstly, thank you so much for sharing some these amazing projects and some lovely anecdotes, Jyotirwala, particularly that I appreciate. I was just thinking about this. George Orwell said that political language is designed to obscure information and not reveal it. And as a translator, how do you reconcile the question of legitimacy? And what kind of burden do you think a translator of not these everyday manuals and so on that are manuals that do not have a significant impact, but think about the larger questions related to religion, related to, let's say, the relationship between the state and its people, and so on. I believe I've communicated that.
Well, I'll give an, if I may, I'll give an example of, I'm Pakistani. I grew up in Karachi. And when I had a job as foreign editor in a newspaper in Bombay, so I had a job in media, every day at work, certainly, this issue would come up, exactly as you have framed it. So I just found myself thinking like a long distance runner or long distance swimmer, like I'm going to be going against this grain as well as I can and still keep my job. So there was a frame. Now that I'm going to do this, but there's a frame. Like I shouldn't alienate everybody. But I am determined emotionally and ethically to do what you're saying should be done.
The question is for
all three, yeah, of course.
Yeah, if I can say, you mentioned that the manuals really do not have implications, but as the talk actually said, they do. And even the fact that we're using an A3, A4 sheet of paper is a highly political decision behind it to, join the global market and to let trade flow across the national borders. So I would not overlook actually the very strong political agency of very small things that, I actually didn't have time to show, but my last slide was how post-Tanzanian independence, despite this desire to be self-reliant and completely independent, there's a document in 1965 mandating the return, not the return, but the introduction of the metrication system, that, metric system of units would really facilitate trade and simplify a lot of the trade relations, which was good for business, but also creating new dependencies. So I think those things actually always have political implications.
So I'll give you, I'll kind of slide back into my literary training and give you a question and try to give you an answer about what you asked about the responsibility of the translator and the burden of the translator. Those are absolutely on point, excellent things to point out. And so Spivak, the thinker, Gayatri Spivak, who's coming up again and again, she argued, for instance, that translation is first and foremost it's the most intimate act of reading, right? So to get into the kind of architecture of the text and to know, I think somebody said, to know both the source language and the target language equally well, right? And so all of this to say, Walter Benjamin, the famous Jewish German theorist of many things, including translation, argued about the task of the translator, right? Which also, if we read the German, if there's a sense of the translator also is to give up in some sense. Spivak would argue for a responsibility of the translator. And the responsibility, she would say, is to the text, right? So that's one thing, and the idea of the audience is very important. The translator wants to be read, a theatrical performance wants to be seen. But there, thinkers about translation have pointed out that it's a double bind again, because historically, when people have translated things, they have done one of two things. One is they have either domesticated the text, trying to take the foreignness out of the text and make it smooth for the audience for whom they are translating. So that to the point that when you're reading the text in your language, you almost don't realize that you are reading something that has been translated from another language, right? So then there is this other argument. So it appears very different. You can talk about that the translation is being irresponsible to the text. And then the other argument is the opposite, which is to foreignize the translation, to keep the foreignness of the foreign text alive, present us the challenge of dealing with the foreign and the different and the challenging, not make the page smooth, so to say, have the bumps, make us work, get some of it, and not get some of it, and still stick with it, and stay with it till the end. So, one of these have been, but, many people have argued about the foreignness of it, that, they're your responsibility. You're not trying to hide the fact that you're translating from another. You're not interested in it, so you're kind of looking at the target audience. So, there are different ways to think about it, but very good question.
Just
Thank you.
make a comment. Yeah, it's a great question. Just to, inspired by Abhishek's response, I have to say that I would, I would venture to say that the text is civilization, and India and for me, the text is civilization, and India and Pakistan are two languages. So when I'd be working between them, I'd be trying to be, I try to be faithful to the civilization, which is all of us.
The question of fidelity and faithfulness has been this whole thing with translation, right? Which is why then the Italian saying goes that the translators are traitors. So, and translation, like all technology and practices, can cut both ways. So anyway, thank you. You had a question.
It's on. Well, thank you to the three panelists. I thought that was really, super interesting. Abhishek, you had talked about translation as a political act. We've heard about agency and choice. We've heard about this typewriter, Maria, that you were talking about, right? Where the letters weren't quite there. What I haven't heard you guys talk about fully is not translating. Making that choice, actually. Saying, no, we're not going to do it. That typewriter is going to have to figure out how to spell my name. Making not translating a political act.
Yes.
Because I live between two cultures that fully, two cultures, and there are times when, me being understood, me being translated is what you were talking about, being smooth. And there are times when I'm like, you can't actually translate me or this. You're going to have to deal with the complexity of what it is. So it'd be great to be able to hear from you guys a little bit around, that choice to make, we're not going to translate. Rehan, you did not translate what a juta was. We translate less and less now. Those of us who have to translate in order to be understood. And it's lovely that, we don't translate as much anymore, where we're grapple with us.
Can I go first? Thank you again. Wonderful question. But this refusal, as you said, is also a choice, right? The refusing to translate, refusing to, and my habit, I guess scholarly academic habit would be to cite somebody who's thought about, the Caribbean scholar Edward Glisson, who's talked about a right to opacity, the right to kind of retain that which cannot be, doesn't have to be, refuses to be translated, right? And explain everything, footnote everything, have a glossary of everything, and not to do that. But those are all creative choices. And we can exist in a world probably where all of these are at play, and then everybody does those things. And also, we are talking about, us, me, and an audience, etc. But translation also often gets stuck within the binary. It's not just these, it's not always one language and another. There is a whole question of multilingualism that's out there, that how do we negotiate these things, can translations take on multiple languages at the same time and not just be between one and the other, right? So again, thank you for the questions, but
yeah, thank you so much for the question. Really interesting what it means in the context of design, actually. What would be the refusal to translate for a design object? Maybe in the end, not designing would be a refusal to translate to a different context. So just not doing it. But just a little bit to expand, so I work on a project of Norwegian, Danish, and Swedish people working in Southeast Africa. And so, because between them, they also have 3 different languages. And so how to communicate and this kind of project meetings that I'm reading, I think it's a very interesting choice when each language is chosen, depending on the kind of audience and the audience of the letter or the circularium or something, and how also the tone of discussion changes depending on where they are and how the discussion goes. And then the kind of English documents become the outward-facing documentation to the outside world, while the Nordic language ones are reflective of a very different type of discussion happening kind of on the inside of where they were. So I think there's also this, some documents are more suited for the internal use, and the translation kind of refuses to happen there. So
I think this opacity thing is very important for survival. Like, so they don't, I'm still thinking about when your skin is the language or your identity is the language. So people it's important that for survival and to thrive when people can't read you, and you have control over that. Yeah. So yes, like, are you Muslim? Are you Hindu? Are you man, woman? Sometimes can be important.
Maybe we can take one more question if there is, and then, okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for the, hello?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that wonderful panel. I'd just like you to comment on, the everyday translation, like Google Translate, and where are we going with translations with artificial intelligence? And recently, I was kind of like transcribing something, and the software itself was translating 2 languages. So that was quite remarkable. So can you just comment on, and because those softwares are also being created in the West or in the global West. So that in itself kind of like dilutes, I don't know, how the translation is going to be comprehended, what meanings are you going to create? So can you kind of comment on that also? Where are we going with technology, where the technology is being created,
Thank you. If you want to take this first.
Well, I think that kind of translation, I've worked with it. There's a flattening out. So I'm not so worried about it as an artist, as a creative person, because I think I'll always do better than that. Because I can sense the flattening out. That's, I don't have that anxiety yet. It hasn't impressed.
But the fact that we're on social media, even on Twitter, X, you can translate religion, you can translate a tweet. So what happens?
I think it's a lazy person's way of communicating. So.
Maria? Again, I will answer a little bit from my perspective. I work with this very large heaps of documents, and of course now with the latest iPhone and the latest MacBook, there's kind of embedded character recognition when you take pictures of archival documents, so you can highlight and move things to places, which makes it a very different way of working with text. But then at the same time, of course, when it's English, it's one thing. When it's Nordic languages, it works far with recognition of characters. And then you also think, about this technology that is translated from a certain point, kind of radiating to other areas. So it works, for example, worse with Swedish and far worse with Norwegian language. And then also, of course, how do you then, it really changes how you work with text overall, because one thing is if you can search for a word in a gigantic pile of photographs versus you have to actually sit and read every single page searching for information, or more like sorting information. So I think from a kind of methodological standpoint, this language and the shift to more automation and automatic character recognition, it does create very different workflows.
Yeah, and I'll just say that I share the anxieties around the newness of the technology, I guess, that some of us, that many of us might have. The flattening, etc. But it's so to kind of feel better about it. I think of these things, and I'm not an expert, as large language models, which is what they are. And these large language models do things depending on how they are trained, on what they are trained, right? So that's a place where we can intervene, right? How these things, I mean, the biases so-called show up because the samples that they're being trained on, whether it's facial recognition or whether it's predictive text, are still limited in some sense. I mean, we saw this with how Wikipedia is largely in English. So we've been at these moments, and these kind of technologies have been with us. So I do have the concerns, and I do think there is a place to work with that. But kind of go into the poetic register, if I may say, I want to be hopeful about the fact that maybe the chatbots and artificial intelligence can take care of some of the prosaic, mundane, so-called prosaic, as opposed to poetry, though they keep trying to write poetry, which is fascinating. Some of the mundane stuff where we need machine quick translation. When I'm lost, I need direction, I need a menu. The food can be a whole different thing, translating. But I think we might have an opportunity here to move from just translating between named languages to going towards trying to translate between registers of languages, and not just dialects, So maybe that's something that could be more exciting, and people who know more about artificial intelligence. And I was at a conference recently on exactly that, and it was very heartening to hear very, solid AI people kind of agreeing with this idea that, so it kind of offers us an opportunity to problematize the limitedness of named languages. How we hear something and you're like, yeah, but my version is a little different, or in my part of the world, the same thing is said a little differently. So can we then think of now also talking about those registers which get lost or have been lost, and because the dominant version shows up when we translate, we're again having to choose, right, into which one. So, so I guess we'll come to a place where all of these are next to each other. So hopefully it's not all concern. So thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, you get the last question. Thank you.
I just want to share that once I went to World Trade Center, and there on the elevator, it was written in different languages, welcome. And in Punjabi, it was written Jiayan. And I felt that no other language expresses that. What I mean to say is that each word has a connotation.
Absolutely.
So when you're translating the literature and all that, the word is just like, it triggers some thoughts. How do you do justice to that?
Easy answer would be to continue to generate more and more translations and more versions of this, because there can always be more takes on the same, and that's what is, I think, unique, compelling, powerful, and also frustrating about the medium that is language. We've tried to kind of, again, domesticate it, and keeps exceeding and surprising us in ways. And poetry is where it's most obvious that it says things which does not refer to anything out in the world. So that cities of the mind thing again. But yeah, okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Did any of you want to say something?
Thank you, distinguished speakers. What a wonderful and interactive session. May I please request everyone to please proceed for the hackathons. Our ushers will guide you to your respective studios. And then I would request everybody to please be back here by 6 p.m. so that we may continue with the remaining sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.